Hello friends, I will share what I know about Palestine and Israel. Please listen. Issued a task to destroy the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which was considered terrorists. They constantly shelled Galilee. On June 3rd, Palestinian militants killed the Israeli ambassador in London. Israel's offensive began on June 5th, the 15th anniversary of the Six-Day War. Israeli forces defeated the Syrian army, Palestinian formations, and their Lebanese ally, capturing the cities of Tyre and Sidon. They also entered the capital of the country, Beirut. The turning point came in 1999 when an agreement was reached in Oslo on mutual recognition between Israel and the PLO. As negotiation partners, the PLO officially announced its renunciation of terrorism in 1994. An agreement on self-government for parts of the Palestinian territories was signed in the same year. After another year, Israeli troops withdrew from several Palestinian cities. 5 years later, the Palestinian National Authority was established in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. However, the conflicts did not entirely cease. Although there were no major wars, periodic shelling and rocket attacks continued. In 2005, as part of Israel's unilateral disengagement plan, Israeli settlers were evacuated from the Gaza Strip, and all Israeli settlements were destroyed. After this, the control of the Gaza Strip was taken over by the radical Palestinian movement, Hamas. In August 2006, a large-scale armed conflict began between the State of Israel and the radical group Hezbollah, which controlled the southern regions of Lebanon. Hezbollah initiated the attack, but the Israeli army managed to clear the territory of the militants. Unfortunately, the military operations in southern Lebanon were accompanied by continuous bombardments of populated areas and infrastructure targets across the country. On October 1, 2006, Israel completed the withdrawal of troops from southern Lebanon, transferring power to the Lebanese government's army and UN peacekeepers. One of the most blood-soaked operations initiated by the Israeli army was called Operation Cast Lead. It began with a multi-day bombing of Gaza in late 2008. From January 3, 2009, Israeli servicemen crossed the border and entered the fighting. Within the first week, more than 750 objects, allegedly related to terrorist activity, were destroyed in the Gaza Strip. In response, Palestinians launched 500 rockets and missiles toward southern regions of Israel, where over 500,000 people reside. During the ground operation, the Israeli army occupied a significant portion of the border regions, declared the destruction of hundreds of militants, but fighting continued. Today's roots of the conflict remain the same. Palestinians demand that the future borders between two sovereign states follow the lines that existed before the Six-Day War, with a possible territorial exchange in East Jerusalem. They envision East Jerusalem as their capital. Israel refuses to return to the 1967 borders and insists on a united Jerusalem. The Israeli operation against the Islamic Jihad began on August 5 in Tel Aviv. It was explained by the need to eliminate a specific threat to Israeli citizens. The basis for this was the Islamic Jihad's initiation of a jihadist war against Israel. In response, the Israeli army struck the Gaza Strip. 15 terrorists were killed, including the military wing's leaders. In turn, Palestine accused Israel of aggression since the strikes were aimed at densely populated residential areas. The Ministry of Health of the Palestinian enclave reported 43 deaths and 311 injuries, including 15 children. In response, they attempted rocket attacks against Israel, but most of them were intercepted by the Iron Dome missile defense system developed by the Israeli company Rafael. The Iron Dome system was put into service in 2011 to defend against Gaza rockets. The system launches guided missiles to intercept incoming rockets and other short-range threats in the air. Each individual Iron Dome system consists of a radar, control center, and launcher. The radar and control center identify rockets immediately after launch and calculate the trajectory and approximate landing point. Despite a declared ceasefire, both sides refuse to relinquish their claims and continue to accuse each other of aggression. Therefore, this is clearly not the last armed conflict in the Gaza Strip. Why Israel and Palestine hate each other so much? Why can't the world find a solution to this conflict that would satisfy everyone? Why are these two peoples competing for a small piece of land, just 25,000 square meters, in the scorching sun? Today, resolving the Palestinian problem seems a bit more problematic than it was in 1948. It was back then when the State of Israel was declared and the Arab-Israeli conflict began. This conflict has claimed over 60,000 lives in the last 70 years. Sometimes it subsides, and sometimes it flares up, but it never truly ends. Palestinian militants launch rocket attacks on Israeli cities and the Gaza Strip, all while official battles are not taking place today. The United States and Russia, as always, are concerned about the situation and hold consultations. However, the conflict between Israel and Palestine will not end. The Jewish kingdom in Palestine fell apart in the 1st century AD due to the Roman Empire's onslaught. Since then, the region had multiple rulers, but Jews scattered across European countries considered this land their sacred homeland to which they should return. Theodor Herzl, an Austro-Hungarian journalist and the founder of the Jewish state, wrote a brochure in 1896 entitled The Jewish State. In it, Herzl called on the international community to help Jews create their own state in Palestine. A year later, he founded the World Zionist Organization. Zionism is the ideology of the return of Jews to their historical homeland and the establishment of their own state there. Jewish migration to Palestine steadily increased, with wealthy European Jews, including the Rothschilds and Montefiore's, raising funds to buy land in Palestine. By the mid-19th century, Palestine was home to about 400,000 people, of whom only 6,000 were Jews, and the rest were Arabs. Palestine was a poor province of the Ottoman Empire, and the land was mainly owned by large Arab feudal lords who leased it to peasants. The World Zionist Organization bought land from these same feudal lords, and then both seller and buyer gave peasants the ultimatum: you no longer have the right to live here, in other words, depriving the fellahin of their homes and livelihoods. The main cause of the conflict can be summed up as follows: warriors and territorial disputes. It all started with the sale of this land to Jews who immigrated to Palestine. This migration was considered an intrusion of uninvited guests by the Arabs, as they saw it akin to strangers coming into your home and claiming that their ancestors lived there in ancient times, making it their house. At the end of World War I, the Ottoman Empire dissolved, and the League of Nations, an international organization that existed between the two world wars, similar to the UN, declared that temporary control of Palestine would be transferred to the United Kingdom due to the tension between the two world wars in Europe. Jewish migration to Palestine accelerated towards the end of the 1930s. The Jewish community in Palestine had grown to 400,000 people, and political parties and illegal armed groups emerged. The number of Arabs was approaching 1 million, and they had their own military groups. After World War II, it became clear that there could be no talk of a single state for Jews and Arabs. Conflict could erupt immediately. The region was divided into two states, a Jewish state and an Arab state, depending on the location of the population. Jerusalem, a city of three religions, was declared an international territory. The Jewish community in Palestine agreed to the plan, but the Arabs did not even want to hear about it. If any part of Palestine is touched by Jews, it will remain in flames and blood, said a representative of the Higher Arab Committee. On November 29, 1947, a resolution on the division of Palestine was adopted with the proclamation of the independence of Israel. Egypt, Syria, Transjordan, Iraq, and others invaded Israel. The demand was clear: Palestine should belong to the Arabs, and Jews can go wherever they want. But the Arab states achieved no results. In 1949, Israel repelled all attacks and destroyed the invading armies. At the same time, it occupied an area of 1,300 square meters beyond the land allocated in the UN plan. In 1967, due to heightened tensions between Israel and its neighboring Arab states, the situation escalated. Egypt, Syria, and Jordan massed large armies on their borders with Israel, which was perceived as preparations for an attack. On June 5, Israel launched a preemptive strike. In just 6 days, the events that would go down in history as the Six-Day War took place. Israel took control of Gaza, the Sinai Peninsula, which belonged to Egypt since 1949, the West Bank, and the Golan Heights from Syria. Eastern Jerusalem remained under Israeli control. The Six-Day War, referred to as the Nakba by the Arabs, resulted in an even more painful defeat than before. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinian Arabs left their homes. Israel lost around 800 people, while Arab states lost approximately 15,000 soldiers. During this war, Israel expanded its territory threefold compared to the pre-war period. The status of Jerusalem, historically significant for both Muslims and Jews, remains an insurmountable obstacle in all negotiations between Israel and Palestine. In 1980, Israel declared Jerusalem as its sole and undivided capital. In negotiations with Israel to resolve the conflict, the Palestinian side demands a return to the 1967 borders and the recognition of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip as the territory of the Palestinian state. The problem is that Jerusalem did not belong entirely to Israel before 1967. Israel is opposed to relinquishing even half of Jerusalem to the Palestinians, especially from a security perspective. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict should not be confused with the Israeli-Arab conflict. After the Six-Day War, members of the previously united anti-Israeli front, such as Egypt, Jordan, and Syria, began to act more in their own interests. They masked their goals with statements about Arab unity and support for their Palestinian brothers, while the fate of the Palestinians concerns only the Palestinians. Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat initiated the Oslo process with the mediation of U.S. President Clinton. A series of meetings were held in the Norwegian capital to discuss a path to solve the Palestinian issue. As a result, temporary agreements were reached in 1993 to 1995. A Palestinian National Authority was established, which effectively became the Palestinian government, and the Gaza Strip and a small part of the West Bank came under its administrative control. However, Israel controlled the borders, and the issue of independence remained unaddressed, to be discussed further. Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, who signed a peace treaty with Jordan in 1995 and prepared the ground for an agreement with the Palestinians, was assassinated by Yigal Amir, who opposed the Oslo Accords. Despite Rabin's death, the reconciliation process continued. The Camp David summit in the U.S. in 2000, where Arafat and the new Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak were supposed to sign an agreement to establish a full-fledged Palestinian state with Bill Clinton's mediation, was expected to be the culmination of this process. However, this did not happen, as Arafat was not offered independence for Eastern Jerusalem, the return of all Palestinian refugees to their homes, and his demand for the withdrawal of Israeli troops from the future Palestinian state was not accepted. As a result, the contract was not signed. In 2004, Arafat passed away, and Clinton was no longer the President of the United States. Barak was no longer Israel's Prime Minister. In 2005, Israel's Prime Minister Ariel Sharon allowed the Gaza Strip to determine its fate under a unilateral disengagement plan. Israel withdrew all troops from Gaza and dismantled the settlements. As a result, Hamas came to power in Gaza, further aggravating the situation, and Israel imposed an economic blockade in response. Sharon's move was considered a failure, and now Gaza became a more significant source of instability for Israel than ever before. Israel conducted 3 military operations in Gaza in 2008, 2012, and 2014 to cleanse the region. In addition, 2 governing systems emerged, Hamas in Gaza and the Palestinian Authority on the West Bank. On the world agenda, there are even more crucial and intense conflicts, such as the war in Syria, the conflict in eastern Ukraine, North Korea's nuclear program, and Iran. Currently, no one is attempting to resolve the Palestinian issue. On October 7, 2023, one of the darkest days in Israel's history, a massive attack by the Hamas movement caught the Jewish state by surprise. It is now compared to historical events such as September 11, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941, and the Arab army's attacks on Israel in the 1973 Yom Kippur War. However, this time the suddenness, shock, and higher casualties are even more pronounced, with hundreds dead, many taken as prisoners and hostages. Most significantly, it is clear that this is only the beginning of a new full-scale crisis, or, more accurately, a new type of war, as it's commonly referred to, a hybrid war. The first question here is how prepared Israel is for such a war. Israel has already requested military assistance from the United States, which, as we know, is currently heavily focused on supporting Ukraine. The second question is why the legendary Israeli intelligence services seemingly missed the preparation for this massive and audacious attack. There is already information that the attack was being prepared for many months, possibly even years, but the Israeli intelligence did not consider an attack likely. Lastly, what are the specific goals of Hamas and its allies? While they publicly declare the destruction of Israel as a political slogan, those behind the current operation evidently have more down-to-earth, rational objectives. In the conflict zone, there are several 100,000 people, with hundreds killed and thousands wounded on the Israeli side. The Gaza Strip, against which the Israeli military launched a retaliatory operation, is home to over 2 million people. From there, they report hundreds of casualties. There is now no doubt that this is the largest confrontation between Palestinians and Israelis in decades, unlike anything seen since the days of the Intifada. The situation is very severe and unusual, not because of the bombardment, but due to the infiltration of terrorists into Israeli territory. Such an occurrence hasn't been witnessed since the 1980s, but this time, the scale of infiltration is even larger. There have been multiple simultaneous infiltrations and hostage killings. Many people, both young and old, have been kidnapped. This is the most painful and concerning aspect of this situation for our country. There are conflicting reports on the exact numbers. Hamas claims there are around 100 hostages. However, from what we have observed near the border, there was a gathering of young people camping there for the weekend, and they were all sleeping. The terrorists stormed in, firing at the youths, causing a massacre. Those who survived were taken hostage and led into Gaza. The length of the Gaza-Israel border is 64 kilometers, and the border is heavily fortified with various types of engineering barriers, including both underground and above-ground fences. The above-ground fences are not very complicated and are designed to slow down or deter unauthorized crossings. Terrorists managed to cut through a section of this fence and approach the IDF, Israel Defense Forces, watchtower, where soldiers were monitoring the border using computers. The terrorists suddenly overwhelmed the soldiers and shot them. They then proceeded to the Israeli city of Sderot in the nearby area, killing people they encountered on their way. The militants began breaking into homes, occupying several houses, and barricading themselves. These were apartments where people lived, so the terrorists found food, water, and took people hostage. The town of Sderot was reached, and it is situated slightly south of the city of Nineveh. This situation is reminiscent of the horror of the 1980s, but it involves much more widespread and simultaneous infiltration. To hold out for several days, and even now not all of the militants have been caught. This is the complexity of this operation. How did it happen? How did they fail to react to everything that was happening? How did the terrorists manage to infiltrate Israeli territory? Judging by the footage, it's evident that the Israeli intelligence services did not exert special efforts. The Mossad and the Shin Bet, roughly speaking, intelligence and internal security, are considered some of the best in the world. Mossad is renowned for its extensive operations in tracking and eliminating terrorists worldwide, and Shin Bet is known for its vast undercover work among Palestinians. People used to say that every second person was recruited. Personally, I don't believe it for a second because I know they're well infiltrated by various intelligence agencies, both domestic and foreign. This means they were outwitted and given some false information, suggesting that nothing out of the ordinary would happen. They were led to believe that it would be business as usual, with Palestinians shooting a few rounds and shouting. It appeared to be nothing more than that, allowing them to unleash an onslaught, which was prepared very effectively. The cyber attack on the surveillance and identification systems likely took place before this attack. The sensor system owned by the Israeli security services played a key role because the alarm at the fence where the Palestinians had cut through didn't go off. They used bulldozers to breach the fence, and the security service didn't realize what was happening on the Israeli territory for several hours. During this time, over 250 militants managed to infiltrate. It's an unprecedented occurrence, and everything was meticulously planned for many months. Overall, it all boils down to the confrontation between an Islamist terrorist organization, Hamas, and the State of Israel, with an outright rejection of any peaceful coexistence. Yes, it's the Islamic resistance movement that began in the late 80s during the First Intifada, which is what the Arabs call their violent attempts to reclaim Palestinian territories. In general, the Hamas movement began its path in 1987, rising in the wake of the First Intifada. This movement is significant among the black movements, like the Muslim Brotherhood. There are numerous different organizations now. Most of these organizations are located in the United Arab Emirates, the United States, Canada, EU countries, and even within Israel itself. Hamas is recognized as a terrorist organization. There is a version that initially, this movement was supported by Israel as a competing force against the then leader of Palestine, Yasser Arafat, whom we'll discuss later. Ironically, it was organized, equipped, and staffed. It was essentially an Israeli initiative to create Hamas to control an underling terrorist group in the Gaza Strip. These were the so-called real terrorists who didn't recognize the State of Israel. But what happened was that this group quickly turned into a major organization. Autonomy and turned into the fighters they were supposed to fight, being under the control of Israeli intelligence services. That's precisely who they joined. This group is new. This is called the Frankenstein effect. At the beginning of the invasion, the leader of Hamas army, Mohammed Deif, a legendary figure in the movement, was already closely surrounded by Israeli intelligence and the army since the 90s. He survived several assassination attempts. Astonishingly, he has almost no limbs, if I'm not mistaken, and only one eye and one hand. The operation was named Patap Aliax, in honor of a mosque on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, one of the primary holy sites in Islam. It's also essential for Jews as it's where the sacred Jerusalem temple stood, of which only the famous Western Wall remains. The mountain regularly becomes a place of clashes between Muslims and Jews. One such event became the formal pretext for Hamas invasion. Currently, Hamas has 11 international sponsors. Notably, Iran, and it's well known that despite not being entirely subordinate or dependent on Iran, there are, of course, organizational connections. There are also terrorist instructors, and possibly some developments. It's very plausible that we'll discover, after some time, that this operation was crafted with the support of, for example, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. Of course, the Arab states, it's an Arab movement, Hamas, and the financial source is Qatar. It's completely unrelated to the Qatari, which invests in London and hosts various World Cup events. They've got a wide range of firearms, explosive devices, grenades, rocket launchers, anti-tank guided missiles. Many of these resources are believed to have been received from Hezbollah, who got them from Syria and Iran. There are suicide bombers ready to detonate themselves as kamikazes, and in tunnel construction, they have significant means. They also have a substantial arsenal of rockets. The main activity center of Hamas, the point from which the onslaught began, and where Israel is currently conducting airstrikes, is the Gaza Strip. Together with the west bank of the Jordan River, they make up the Palestinian autonomy. At the same time, these two parts effectively have different leaderships due to the division within the Palestinian Authority. And since 2007, there's been no unified Palestinian leadership. There's Hamas in Gaza, which has weakened its position on the West Bank. Here is where we should pause and delve into history to understand how the State of Israel and the Palestinian autonomy came into existence and, more broadly, how the Arab-Israeli conflict emerged. The new phase of the Arab-Israeli conflict we're witnessing now all started at the end of the 19th century. The inception of the Zionist movement, which aimed to create a Jewish state on the historical territory, marked the first wave of mass Jewish return to Palestine, which wasn't yet Israel, by the mid-20th century. The Jewish population in Palestine was about 600,000, and the Arab population was around 1.4 million in 1947. A recent United Nations plan was created to resolve the conflict, recommending the division of Palestine into separate Jewish and Arab states, with Jerusalem as an international city. The Jews accepted the proposal, while the Arab states and Palestinians rejected it. This led to the 1947-1949 Arab-Israeli War, resulting in Israel's establishment on May 14, 1948. The neighboring Arab states also intervened. The war created a significant refugee issue, with hundreds of thousands of Palestinians displaced. He will attempt to peacefully divide the territory. They proposed a plan for the division of Palestine, which was under British mandate at that time. Jews accepted this plan, while the Arabs rejected it, meaning they were not willing to acknowledge Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state. As soon as the British withdrew, several Arab armies began attacking Israel. This was the first war in 1948, the War of Independence. It actually started a bit earlier than Israel's declaration of independence on May 14, 1948. After that, one war followed another over the next 30 years. Israel and Arab countries would engage in large-scale armed conflicts 4 times. Without going into too much detail, the result was a victory for the Jewish state and a substantial increase in its territory. This included territories such as the Egyptian Sinai Peninsula, the Gaza Strip, the Syrian Golan Heights, and the west bank of the Jordan River. As a result of these wars, Israel enlarged its territory nearly 4-fold compared to what was allocated to it in 1947. In other words, some of these wars started as preventive actions, while others were defensive. It's worth mentioning the Yom Kippur War on October 6, 1973. A coalition of Arab states led by Syria and Egypt suddenly attacked Israel during the religious holiday of Yom Kippur. These attacks started on the same dates, half a century apart. There was an attempt by Hamas to connect to this date, marking the 50th anniversary of the Yom Kippur War, and to link their success to Egypt's claim of victory over Israel. However, this narrative only held for the first few days of the war. Despite the surprise attack, Israel managed to repel it and transition into a counteroffensive, almost reaching Cairo. After the Yom Kippur War, a period of negotiations began in search of a solution to the Arab-Israeli conflict. Israel signed a peace treaty with Egypt, making it the first Arab country to reach a peace agreement with Israel. In return, Israel returned the Sinai Peninsula, which it had occupied during the 1967 war, to Egypt. This was when the formula land for peace was introduced. Many Arab countries never recognized Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state. It was even more complicated to address the issue of the Arab population living on the territory of Palestine before the creation of Israel. By 1948, most of the Arab countries had attacked Israel, which had often resulted in displacement. The majority of the Palestinian Arabs left, abandoning their homes and belongings. Those who fled settled in refugee camps and began organizing politically and militarily. The most significant of these organizations was the Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO, under the leadership of Yasser Arafat. They demanded the establishment of a Palestinian state and resorted to armed struggle against Israel. This armed struggle often included bombings and airplane hijackings. One of the most infamous attacks was the Black September Group's abduction and murder of Israeli athletes at the 1972 Munich Olympics. In response, Israel initiated various military operations in the Palestinian refugee camps. These operations aimed to target militants, but frequently resulted in the loss of innocent lives. The brutality of these operations, often overlooked, was documented by various international organizations, not just Palestinian propaganda. The USA repeatedly sided with Israel in addition to various Arab countries. The Soviet Union actively supported the Palestinians. After the end of the Cold War, it seemed that a compromise would be reached between Yasser Arafat and Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin. Agreements were signed, during which peace between Palestine and Israel was declared. Palestine was to emerge as an independent state with its capital in East Jerusalem. This was supposed to be achieved through a process in which Israel would transfer control over certain areas to the Palestinians. Key Palestinian groups, including the Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO, announced the recognition of Israel's right to exist. Israel, in turn, recognized the PLO as the representative of the Palestinian people. A peace agreement was concluded between Israel and the Palestinian Authority. Palestine was emerging as a state with the capital in East Jerusalem. However, some groups and leaders did not accept this agreement, and the situation remained complex. So, to sum it up, from the late 19th century onwards, the Arab-Israeli conflict emerged. The Zionist movement, which aimed to create a Jewish state on the historical territory, initiated the first wave of mass Jewish immigration into Palestine. This was before it became Israel, and by the mid-20th century, the Jewish population in Palestine reached about 600,000. While the Arab population grew to around 1.4 million by 1947. A recent United Nations proposal aimed to address the conflict by recommending the division of Palestine into separate Jewish and Arab states, with Jerusalem designated as an international city. While the Jews accepted this proposal, the Arab states and the Palestinians rejected it. This led to the Arab-Israeli War of 1947 to 1949, resulting in the establishment of Israel on May 14, 1948. Neighboring Arab states also intervened, and the war created a significant refugee issue, with hundreds of thousands of Palestinians displaced. The late political leader and his successor, Abbas, who currently leads Palestine, were able to return to Palestine. They first returned to Gaza, and a series of negotiations followed. Gradually, discussions shifted to the topic of a Palestinian state. The Palestinian National Authority gained control over the west bank of the Jordan River and the Gaza Strip. However, the question of a Palestinian state remained unresolved, and the negotiations eventually faltered. There were red lines that neither side was willing to cross, including issues related to the division of Jerusalem and Palestinian rights. As a result, negotiations practically came to a halt around 2014. Why was there no final reconciliation? The issue is too vast and complex, exceeding the scope of this context. Israelis argue that Palestine is mired in corruption and not ready for statehood. They claim that the Palestinians lack the political will to make compromises. Eastern Jerusalem is a major stumbling block, as the Palestinians aspire to establish their state with East Jerusalem as its capital. Israeli society is not prepared for this, as they view Jerusalem as the undivided capital of the State of Israel. Furthermore, demographic imbalances are a concern, and Israeli society, in general, is not receptive to this. In its essence, Israel was created through a process driven by the leadership of the Zionist movement, leading to the establishment of the State of Israel under David Ben-Gurion. However, the successors and allies of this approach, including Benjamin Netanyahu, have departed from this position and platform. Israel acts as it wishes, relying on its power and military capabilities. Contrary to international agreements, Israel has continued building new settlements on occupied territories in the West Bank and around Gaza, which has escalated conflicts between Israelis and Palestinians. These have evolved from simmering tension to full-blown uprisings, like the Intifadas. In the 2000s, radical factions, particularly Hamas, gained strength due to the failure of the peace project in Palestine. Over the years, Hamas portrayed itself as a more just and militant alternative to the Palestinian population, positioning itself as being less corrupt. This is partially because Hamas was seen as less involved in corruption at the time and advocated resistance against Israel, rather than negotiations with Israel. Hamas rose to power after the death of Yasser Arafat in 2004. The internal divisions grew, and in 2007, Hamas took control of the Gaza Strip. Since then, the Palestinian Authority has essentially been under a dual administration. As a result of the 2006 election, where the Palestinian population freely voted, Hamas received the majority of the votes. They formed a government and began to assume control, leading to tensions between Hamas and Fatah. They did not share power or resources, including control of security forces. Ultimately, Hamas staged a coup about a year after the elections, taking over the Gaza Strip, which then escalated into this long-standing conflict. Today, Palestinian politics are divided between the Gaza Strip, which is under the control of Hamas, and the West Bank, where Fatah has a presence. While the idea of national reconciliation has been discussed, it has not been successfully implemented. Hamas is in control of Gaza, and Fatah has authority in the West Bank. Both sides have differences and are wary of each other. The 2006 elections in Gaza were indeed democratic, and the results reflected the wishes of the population, with the majority voting for Hamas. However, Hamas's assumption of power led to divisions over issues like budgets and governance, eventually culminating in a violent takeover by Hamas. They did not share power with Fatah in Gaza, which further complicated the political landscape. The situation today has some parallels with the start of the Second Palestinian Intifada, which was a large-scale uprising against Israel. In September 2000, it began due to events at the Temple Mount, which holds a mosque that is sacred to Palestinians. These events spiraled into a series of incidents, and for a considerable time, there was not a day without a significant terror attack in Jerusalem. The situation in the 2000s led to a surge in radicalism, with Hamas gaining traction due to the failure of the peace process. Over time, there was a shift in public sentiment in favor of Hamas. In the early 2000s, Hamas became more prominent, especially as it appeared less corrupt and more committed to resistance against Israel in the negotiations. The group gained popularity and support in Gaza, eventually leading to its control over the territory. This was marked by a democratic process, where people voted for Hamas, yet it eventually evolved into a more complex and confrontational situation. As for Israel, the issue of settlements in the West Bank and Gaza Strip remains contentious. These settlements have been the cause of tension and conflict and have defied international agreements. Groups like Hezbollah, which operate in Lebanon, have taken military action against Israel, albeit not directly conducted by the Lebanese army. These groups are seen as proxies of Iran and have powerful military capabilities. In recent events, the conflict has escalated again. It is a complex situation with deeply rooted political, historical, and social factors. This text appears to be a discussion about various aspects of the conflict in the Middle East, particularly in Lebanon, Israel, and the Palestinian territories. It discusses ideological Shiite groups, Iran's influence, the goals of different parties involved, and the challenges to peace negotiations. Here is the corrected and translated text. The text appears to discuss events in Lebanon during the civil war and the present focus on ideologically motivated Shiite groups. It delves into their involvement in politics. The revolution of Iran also played a role in Lebanon, and Islam was a central theme. The main goal became the fight against Israeli forces, especially when Israel entered the scene. The discussion revolved around weakening Israel, with Iran often mentioned as a key player. However, Israel perceived Iran as a significant threat, leading to covert actions, including attempts to conduct terrorist acts. Israel carried out operations to eliminate Iranian experts connected to nuclear weapons development. Major Arab countries, such as the United Arab Emirates, are believed to remain neutral in this war. Not too long ago, peaceful agreements were signed between them and Israel during the presidency of Donald Trump, and they are unlikely to risk their positive relations. Regarding the conditions under which peace negotiations could resume, it's currently a premature question since active combat is ongoing. It's not clear whether the goals of Hamas militants could lead to long-term success in their attacks, but it seems their primary aim is to demonstrate their strength. There's also a sense that negotiations may not yield results anytime soon, considering Israel's approach, which involves responding to attacks and weakening Hamas through targeted strikes. However, it hasn't prevented a Black Saturday on the 7th of October. It's unlikely that Israel is merely playing games, but the impact of explosions may have lost its effect on the population in Gaza due to their continuous exposure to bombardments. It's a way to maintain the perception of control, but it's evident that the situation is not under control. Today, the scope of attacks has expanded, with Palestinian groups targeting a much larger area. The Prime Minister has mentioned preparing for a large-scale operation. But if the situation escalates significantly in the Gaza Strip, Israel will resort to a much stronger force, potentially requiring the installation of an Iron Dome to protect civilians living in Gaza. As a response, Hamas will gain no territories because it's considered a terrorist organization that doesn't recognize the existence of the State of Israel. Conversations about divisions or compromises are practically non-existent. Please note that the text's context and references may not be completely clear, but this is the corrected and translated version based on the provided content. Thank you friends for listening to me. Please like and subscribe until we meet again.